Well, hello, my name is Andy Merrick. I'm the owner and the primary photographer for Memories by Andy, serving all of northern Michigan. This last couple of weeks have gotten really difficult for a lot of people in the world, even here in northern Michigan, where the state of Michigan has gone on to a shelter-at-home order from the governor. We want to stay safe and stay home. And I had planned on doing a photo clinic, a workshop here in Traverse City on photography basics, getting out of automatic mode. I was going to be doing that Saturday, March 28th. But unfortunately, the current order has got me staying at home. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this video up here on the YouTube channel, let you guys participate in my workshop that I would be putting on. Now, guaranteed this is not going to be the same as if you were to be in an in-person workshop, but it gives you a little bit of an idea on what I'm going to cover, and if you want to sign up for a workshop, I'd love to have you. So I've been a photographer here in northern Michigan professionally for about 1.5 years, 2 years, doing it full-time for about a year. I'm a wedding photographer. I shoot products for some of my customers for their websites so they can sell their products online. I do senior photos, not the old people, but the kids who are graduating from high school. I do family portraits, I do professional headshots, and for fun, my favorite thing to do is landscape photography. I love going out and chasing waterfalls, and since being in the Coast Guard, I've developed a love for lighthouses. So, that's a little bit about myself. I have been carrying a camera since 1985, off and on. I used it when I was in Boy Scouts to capture images of the trip we were on, whether it be in New Mexico backpacking or up in the Sioux, Canada for a winter camp out, and anywhere in between. I also used it when I was in the Coast Guard to document some of the things we did and the places I was lucky enough to visit. One of the struggles that I had when I was trying to transition from being a hobbyist to a professional or capturing better images was switching my camera out of the automatic mode. We spend $500, $1,000, $10,000 on a camera and on gear, and we put it in the manual or the automatic mode, and we expect to be able to get really high quality pictures. When you have a $3,000 camera and a $2,000 lens and you put the camera in the automatic mode, you're not getting the creativity and the full functionality of that camera. So the purpose of this clinic, Photography Basics, is getting out of automatic mode. And that is what I hope to teach you over the next hour. We'll see when it's done. So the first question I ask all my workshop participants is, what is photography? Well, it's kind of important to understand what photography is so you can understand how to use your camera to make the best images you can. So, what is photography? What does it mean to you? Please feel free to put it in your comments. So photography, simply put, is using a camera to capture light. That's all you're doing. Whether it's on film or digitally, you're capturing the light. Next question I'm going to ask you is, how do you take a good photograph? The answer is pretty simple. You make it. You spend a little bit of time looking at figuring out the lighting conditions, figuring out the settings and how you want your camera to best capture that image. Maybe where you're standing, how you composite the picture. There's a lot of things you put into it, your thought pattern, before you push that shutter. It's the difference between taking a picture and making or creating that image. What do you need to consider when you're making a photograph? Well, the first thing is probably what your subject is. Whether it's a person, place, thing, or even a feeling you're trying to get across. Next thing is going to be your lighting and how that's going to affect the image. Then your composition. The composition is how that scene looks in your camera or through your viewfinder. Next thing is going to be the story you want to tell. What is the story you're hoping that this image, when people look at, they're gonna get? Something else you got to think about is what your gear's limitation is. Every camera has advantages and disadvantages when it comes to creating images. Even the most expensive camera won't do certain things. You need to be familiar with your gear and what your gear's limitations are. And then probably the most important and most difficult for all of us photographers is admitting to ourselves what our own limitations are, what we can and can't do. Now, your limitations can be reduced every time you pick up this camera and you push that shutter button and you learn a little something about what you can do and how maybe you can improve your craft. By taking these kind of workshops, by taking classes and participating in clinics will also help you. And another great way, just find another photographer, go out and shoot together, and talk about why you're taking the image, creating that image the way that you are. Ask them why they're taking the image or creating the image the way they are. We all learn together. I think it's pretty safe to say that each one of us who are using cameras at one point or another started out using the automatic mode. I know photographers who've been taking pictures for going on 10 years. They sell some of the most amazing images, a lot of landscape pictures, and they've yet to ever switch out of automatic mode into manual. So it's possible to get good pictures. You're just not going to be able to create the images that you want to until you learn to switch to manual mode. In my opinion, automatic is not your friend. It can help you get started. It can give you a starting point, but learn to switch into automatic, then back to manual, and change your settings accordingly. All right, so let's do a little exercise. I want you to go ahead and grab your camera. Hit pause if you have to. Once you got your camera, we'll get started. Now would be the time for you to hit pause, grab your camera, and come back. All right, welcome back. I'm sure you've got your camera or you have it soon. I want you to go ahead and put your camera into automatic mode. And I want you to find something around you to take a picture of and focus in on that subject and push that shutter button. Now, hit the play button or the review button so you can look at your image. And there should be a way to look on each camera the information on what your settings were on that camera. Go ahead and write those down so you know what your settings were. And we'll do something with that here in just a minute. So our cameras have different settings you can go to. You got manual and automatic. You've also got shutter priority and aperture priority. Shutter priority on some cameras are also called time priority. And what that is that's where you've got control over your shutter speed. The camera then takes care of the ISO, the ISO, or the ISO, depending on how you want to call it, and your aperture. So if you want to control, you want to stop the subject, you can have a faster shutter speed and the camera will take care of the rest where you may end up with a grainy picture or one that's got a pretty shallow depth of field. The other one is going to be your aperture priority, and that's where you get to control the size of the aperture and the camera takes care of your shutter speed and your ISO. So we're going to talk about shutter speed for a minute. The shutter speed is one of the 3 things that you get to control on your camera to help determine what that image is going to look like. If you have a fast shutter speed, that slows down or stops any motion blur or stops that subject. And the slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur or movement that you have in that image. Now there's times that you want to have a whole lot of motion blur. I use it a lot when I'm shooting waterfalls. It gives kind of a cool look to the water. There's other times that you want to have that shutter stop. Maybe you got a drop of water coming from the faucet, or you've got somebody running by, or you're taking a picture of some movement, like maybe planes, and you don't want any motion blur whatsoever. Shutter speed is how you control that. All right, go ahead and grab your camera, and we're going to let you see for yourself how shutter speed works. You're going to probably need a partner to help you with this, or maybe you got a tripod, you can use a timer on it. But this is going to be the arm wave. So I want you to go ahead, take your camera, set the shutter speed at 1/30 or 1/30th of a second. And then take your picture with your arms waving like this. Then I want you to take another picture, and I want you to go 1/200th of a second. And your arms once again waving like that. And then one more time. Set it for 1 second. And once again, take a picture with your arms moving like this. Now I recommend that you do this in the shutter priority or time priority, which will either be an S or a T on your camera, depending on the make or model. All right, aperture priority. What exactly is the aperture on a camera? Aperture is the opening that allows light to hit your sensor or your film. Kind of like the pupil in your eye. Now the numbering system for aperture is a little weird. It's kind of hard for me to get used to. The smaller the number, the bigger the opening in the camera. So the smaller your aperture number, like f1.4, f2.8, it's going to have a bigger opening than, say, your f8 or f16 or f22. I've been told that your aperture, your f-stop, has to do with the distance from the edge of the opening to the edge of your lens. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but it kind of helps me out a little bit. So the smaller the number, the smaller the distance from the edge of your aperture opening to the edge of the lens. So an f1.4 has a very small space between that, whereas an f8 has a much bigger space. Once again, not sure that's right, but it helps me remember. It's the distance between, basically, the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. Now that means that more light is let in, and people refer to a small aperture. Small number, a large aperture. Gets confusing. I'm going to refer to a small aperture as a small number. That may not be correct in everybody's terms, but at least that way you know what I'm talking about. So a small aperture, people call a fast lens. The smaller that will go. Now what that means is by letting more light in, you can change your shutter speed and you can allow your shutter speed to be faster. So what effect does the aperture have on an image? How does it change it? That's something you need to know so you can make sure you're adjusting it the way you want. You know, sometimes you see these pictures that people take, the portraits or the ones where you got the subject is really, really sharp and the background is a little out of focus. All right, let's see for yourselves how this works. Grab 3 things from your pocket so they're near you. I like to use 3 batteries. And people go, well, why do you use batteries? Well, because the batteries have words on them, and that allows me to see how this thing gets in focus and out of focus. I've got something as a reference, and they're all the same. But you don't need to grab 3 batteries. You can grab 3 anything. They're relatively small. Once you got those, go ahead and hit play again. Until then, hit the pause button. So, here we are. We got 3 like things. 3 AAA, nope, scratch that, AA Energizer Max batteries. I'm going to turn them so that they're all facing the same way. I'm going to put them 1 hand length apart, or width apart, give or take. So you've got the same space between the 3. And this is going to be what I'm going to take a picture of to try to show you in the various apertures what the depth of field does. All right, so here we are. Got my camera set. Take a picture at 2.8. Gonna put my focus on the front battery. Then I'm gonna change my aperture to 5.6. Still focusing on the front battery. You can see a little bit of greater depth of field. Then I'm gonna go to f8. Take another picture, still focusing on the front battery. I'm gonna take one more at f13. Then we're going to go ahead and take one more at f22. All right, now you've got a little bit of an idea how these work and what the aperture does and what the shutter speed does. Now, what exactly can you do when you're in manual mode? You get the most amount of control. You control the speed, you control the aperture, and you control the ISO or ISO. Something to keep in mind when you're taking a picture is what they refer to as the triangle, the exposure triangle. All 3 of these things work together so you get this triangle, and if you change one thing but don't change another, your triangle gets all out of whack. You want to end up with a triangle that gives you the perfect exposure. Just like this little chart here shows. Now when you're looking at the 3 things, you got your aperture, and remember that has to do with your depth of field. The bigger the number, the greater the depth of field, but the less light that's let in. With shutter speed, the longer that shutter is open, the more light that's let in, but the more blurry your picture gets with motion blur. The faster the shutter, the less time it's open, so less light that's let in, but the less blur. You stop a lot of action with that. And then your ISO. Your ISO we haven't touched on yet, but What the ISO is it's the sensitivity your sensor or your film has to light. So the lower the ISO, like ISO 50, it's going to be less sensitive to the light. It's going to work in brighter situations. ISO or ISO 25,600 is going to be much more sensitive to the light. So if you're working in a really low light situation, it doesn't need to have as much light exposed to that film or that sensor for it to pick up the image. The problem is, the bigger the ISO, the more grain that's brought into that image. So the smaller the ISO, the sharper the image and the less grain that's there. The higher the ISO, the more grain you get in, but the more light, so you can work in lower light situations and you can keep up your shutter speed and maybe let your aperture close up a little bit. All those work together in the exposure triangle. So it really depends on how you want your grain. Some people like a grainy image because it's just their style, it's artistic. Your depth of field, there's times that you want to have that background out of focus. There's times you want that image from front to back, all the way in focus. And then the sharpness, or how crisp that image is because of the motion blur. There's times you want a little bit of motion blur and there's times you don't. I like shooting vehicles or bicyclists so that the car, I track it with my camera. I take the picture, click, and keep following them. The car is in focus and is stop action because I'm following it with my camera. But the background behind the car's got a little bit of blur. A lot of motorsport people will do that, so you get some blur behind so you can see the motion that car is actually moving. It's not just parked there in the street or on the racetrack. All right. Who's ready for manual mode? Ready to take control of that camera? Ready to see what it can do? Well, first thing I want you to do is I want you to grab that camera and once again put it into auto. I know. Auto's not your friend. But humor me. Go ahead, put it into auto. From the place you were before, take that same picture you did a little bit ago. Hit the play button so you can look at that image. Get the data on it so you can see what your ISO and your shutter speed and your aperture were. Write those down next to the last one you took that picture of and tell me, are they the same? A lot of times they change just a little bit. And that's because the camera's making these decisions for you. Now look at those images side by side and they look the same. A lot of times they're pretty close. All right, so you've got the image. You've got the settings, and you know a starting point. Go ahead and put your camera into the M, or manual mode. Set your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed to one of those two pictures that you took. I'll wait for you for a second. Probably going to get demonetized because we're using someone else's song. All right. Now go ahead and take a picture. The same picture you did before. How'd that turn out? Should have turned out all right. Now on your camera somewhere, either for your viewfinder or on your LCD screen in live mode, or if your mirrorless are all live mode, you're able to look at a histogram. The histogram is a little picture, digital display, a chart that shows a bunch of different bars and spikes and stuff across it, showing how well lit that image is. You want everything as close to the middle as you can. If it's too far to the right, it's overexposed. If too far to the left, it's underexposed. Take a look at that histogram on the picture. Should be pretty close to the middle. Now when you're looking, you can, in most cameras, you can turn on your camera's settings so you see the histogram when you're taking a picture. Why don't you go ahead and see if you can figure that out. Look in your owner's manual if you have to. Hit pause. We'll be here when you get back. All right. So you've got your settings in your camera. You've taken your picture. Now I want you to change your shutter speed. If you were to change your shutter speed so it was a faster image, so let's say you were at 1/60th and you went to 1/80th of a second, that changed one of those legs on that exposure triangle. So going from 1/60th to 1/80th is underexposing that image. So you need to either change your aperture or your ISO or both. That equivalent to bring it back into exposure. I like to leave my ISO alone most of the time because I want that grain as minimized as possible. So you're probably going to have to make your aperture a little bit smaller. Remember, when I say smaller, I mean a smaller number, not a smaller opening. So go ahead and change both of those. Click up one, click down the other. Take that image again, take a look at it. Should look about the same. Take a look at your histogram, see if it looks about the same. All right, now let's recap a little bit here. There's 3 things that you control when you're in manual mode. Actually, there's a lot more than that, but there's 3 things that manual mode versus automatic mode will let you control in a DSLR or a mirrorless camera or a film camera, 35mm or what have you. First thing is going to be your aperture, and the aperture controls how much light is let in, just like the pupil of your eye. But the smaller the aperture, the more light that's let in, and the smaller your depth of field. The higher the aperture, the less light that's let in, and the greater your depth of field. You got your shutter speed. The longer your shutter is open, the more light that's let in, but the more things get blurry. The shorter your shutter speed, the less light that's let in, and things look sharp. You stop motion. Then you've got your ISO, or your ISO. That is your sensitivity that your sensor or your film has to light. The smaller the number, the less sensitive it is, but the clearer that image will be, or sharper that image will be. The larger, higher your ISO or ISO is, the more sensitive the light it is, but yet the more grain that you end up with in your image. These are all artistic things. Motion blur, depth of field, and grain all have to do with how that image is going to look and how artistic you want to be when creating your photos. Best way to get better is to take your camera, go outside, and take some pictures. The more pictures you take, the more shutters you click, the better your images are going to look. Now, there's some other things that you need to consider when you're doing photography. One is going to be your camera body, the brains, if you will, of the camera. Next is going to be your lenses. You've got a couple of different types of lenses. Prime lenses are going to be one that's one focal length, like a 50mm lens. That's only going to allow you to focus in at the equivalent, or a 50mm focal length or distance. You've then got macro lenses. You can have a prime or a telephoto macro lens, but a macro is a 1-to-1 ratio, so you get a lot sharper image. You then got the telephoto lens, which unlike a prime, has a variety, or you can vary what your focal length is. So you can go from a 12 millimeter to 70 millimeter. You can zoom in without having to walk closer, zoom away without having to back up physically with your camera. And then you've got a fisheye or a wide angle lens, which helps you see really wide panoramic looks. Problem with some of those that you got to keep in mind is the fisheye look that you can end up with if you don't have, is the outside edges of that image start to become a little distorted. Next thing you got to think about is lighting. You know, there's a lot of people who use natural lighting as their way of taking pictures. You're kind of controlled by what the environment is doing there. With lighting, you've got strobes. Some people will call them studio strobes. I mean, there's all kinds of names for it, but those are the ones that are the really bright flash that typically aren't going to be mounted onto your camera. In fact, I don't think you can. They're too big. Next thing is going to be reflectors. That's a device that will help bounce light. You can direct light. It can be a mirror if you wanted, or there's professional deflectors or reflectors, or you can use like white poster board or white styrofoam or corrugated plastic to help bounce that light. Next thing is going to be your hot lights. Oftentimes those are called studio lights. They're a constant light source. Heck, your lamp could be a hot light. meaning it's hot, it's on all the time, it's not strobing. And then you've got your flash or your camera strobes. Those are going to be a little bit more portable, and they're going to be something a lot of times will be mounted on camera. I can get into a whole nother video later on flash. Something else that's pretty important to consider is a tripod. If you're going to be doing some longer exposures, you want to keep that camera steady. There's some photographers out there that say that you need a tripod for every picture you take. I'm not one of those guys. Next thing is going to be editing software. If you're going to shoot anything but JPEG, you're going to need to edit that image somehow to convert it from a RAW file to a JPEG so you can share it on social media or on websites or with other people. And there's a lot of different types of editing software out there from the Adobe suite. Apple has some. Luminar 4 is another program I started playing around with. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of editing software out there that you can use. And then different filters for your camera. There's ND filters, which are neutral density. Basically the equivalent of putting a pair of sunglasses on your camera. It allows you to have less light coming in. You've got polarizing filters that will help cut down some glare and makes the sky a little bit bluer. There's protective filters, there's gradient filters, there's just a bunch of different filters, and we can cover that in a different video. But it's just things that you need to think about when you're taking pictures and the gear that you've got. So one of the most popular rules is the rule of thirds. And what you do for the rule of thirds is you look at look through your viewfinder, you find your subject, and you imagine in your head 2 lines coming down, 2 lines coming across. Creates kind of like a tic-tac-toe board. And what you want is you want to center your subject. That's not right. You want your subject, one of those lines that you drew. Either the up and down or the side to side. Side to side, up and down. So right now I'm centered in the image. Now I'm on a third. 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 There's different ways that you can do that utilizing the rule of thirds, because by doing that it shows some thought was put into it. And it changes the way the image looks. Like the images on these slides, you can see the fire chief is just a little bit off to the side. And if you look at the picture of me, not properly exposed, oops, you'll see that I'm off to the side a little bit and I'm looking towards the negative space on the picture. Reason being, that creates your eye to go that way. It helps you see the image better. Another rule of composition is leading lines. Because what you want is you want your eyes to follow that picture right to that subject or follow it to the end. If you look at the little trail there, the sides of the trail kind of guide your eyes down the trail all the way to the end of that picture. If you look at the river, the tree line kind of creates that same leading lines following you all the way to where that river ends at the picture. Leading lines are a little tougher for me to find good examples of in my photography, because that's not something that I look at a lot, but is there. And I'm getting better, I'm out practicing. So I recommend that you play around with the rule of thirds I talked about a moment ago, and try to find some images that you can create that have leading lines, that the lines take you to your subject. Another one of the rules that we talk about is fill the frame. You want to put as much as you can of that image that you're trying to capture, the subject, into the frame. You want your picture to be the majority so you don't have a lot of dead space around it. Now if you look at these 2 pictures of the beautiful lighthouse up in Marquette, Michigan, up on Michigan's Upper Peninsula, you're going to see that both images look pretty good. I actually like the one where the frame is filled with the sky and the little island and the shoreline and the water. There's something to be said about filling that frame and bringing that lighthouse in closer, zooming in on it if you will, or walking closer if you can, to fill that picture as much as you can so you see the subject. Your eye isn't distracted by all the other stuff around it. So it really depends on what message you're trying to send with that picture. The picture with all the background and the shoreline and all that kind of shows that the lighthouse is a little isolated out on an island, separated from the mainland. You're not right there walking up on it. Whereas the other one where it's up close, it looks kind of like you can get right there and that the lighthouse is bigger than life and easily accessible by everybody. So both of those images tell a different story. When I was putting together this slideshow for this workshop, a year and a half ago, probably need to update some pictures, I couldn't find any pictures that I had where I didn't follow the rule of watch the background. But I do have these 2 pictures here. One is of the deer And one is of a smokestack from some of the old copper mining equipment and industry that was up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. You can see that big stack coming out of the tree line. Well, if you were to have somebody's picture being taken there, and they were standing just so that stack was coming out of their head, that wouldn't look right. So they talk about watching that background. You'd have that person shift over to the left or right, or maybe you'd move a little bit so that stack wasn't coming right out of the top of their head. That would just take away from a picture of a couple or a person standing there in that field. But if the deer, it kind of shows that. It looks like that tree behind the deer is kind of a set of antlers that the deer has. Green leafy antlers. That's where I wasn't paying attention to the background as much as I normally would, but it's the forest and it's a deer and it's in the woods. But if I'd have waited a minute or I'd have moved just a little bit, maybe I could have got a better shot of that where that didn't have that tree growing out the top of its head. So that's what they mean when they talk about watch the background. I see a lot of pictures where people have weird things going on behind them. Sometimes it's a person walking behind them, or if they'd have waited just a couple seconds, they had a clean image that didn't have distractions behind. Use frames. That's a rule that's kind of interesting. I've started playing around with it a little bit more. You can see from Fayette, the picture on my left, of the old building with the window in it. I used the window to frame the limestone cliffs there along Lake Superior. I used the building and the window as a frame. So if you look at that picture on the right there, that's from the state park in Baraga, Michigan, up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, right kind of at the base of the Keweenaw. I used the two trees on the side to kind of frame in the bay there, and the smokestacks from the factory or the plant across the bay. Somewhere in the background there is Mount Arvon, which is Michigan's highest natural point. Now there's Eagle Mine has got a higher point, but has been because of the mining and they've just been stacking up the dirt that they pulled out of the mine. I don't think that's a good justification for the highest point. But anyways, use frames. I've been playing around with this a little bit more, and it's kind of fun to find a spot where you can get an image and find a window or find something that helps frame that image. Kind of focus in then on the subject. The cliffs are definitely a good example of the framing. Having those two trees there, it's framing, but not the same impact as you get from the window. Another rule when it comes to composition is look for symmetry or patterns. So you can see the stones, they kind of make a little bit of a pattern there of, it's the best I had, sorry. But there's patterns out there, and if you capture them, it really does make an impact on the image. But the symmetry, the two towers from the furnaces there in Fayette, that's some symmetry. You got the building looks the same on either side, and other than the little cupola that I got in there. But it really makes the image look a lot more powerful than if I didn't frame that in right and center that a little bit and get those two stacks right next to each other. If I cut one of those off, or it just doesn't have the same power as the symmetry, having the picture balanced. One of the questions I'm often asked is, how do you get better at making photographs? Well, I could give a really long, in-depth answer on that, but the best one is get outside. Carry your camera everywhere you go. And push that shutter button as often as you can. But don't just point and shoot. Take a little bit of time to think about what you're doing. Think about your composition. Think about the story you're trying to tell with that image. What exactly is it you want to capture? How do you want to set your aperture and your shutter speed and your ISO or your ISO to capture the image the best you can? Do you want to zoom in and fill that frame, or do you want to step back a little bit and show the whole picture? These are important things to think about and to practice as often as you can. If you've liked this video, you learned anything from it, could you do me a favor and hit that like button? Would you subscribe if you haven't already? And maybe leave me a comment to let me know what you learned. I appreciate it, and trust me, it means a lot more than you know. I look forward to seeing you on the other side of the lens. One of the challenges that I faced when I was trying to Here we go again. In 3, 2, 1. This is where we cut it out, we put something else in, and we come back. All right. So a lot of the cameras have different types of settings that'll control different aspects. You've got your shutter speed, and that's where you get to control the shutter speed, and the camera takes care of the aperture and takes care of the ISO. Wow. We'll do that again in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Composition. Nope. Here we go again. Have an itch first. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.